Hans Niemann against Magnus Carlsen. They just came from their clash in the Crypto Cup, which was the very match that birthed the phrase "the chess speaks for itself." When Hans Niemann beat Carlsen in game one, uttered that famous phrase, and then proceeded to lose the match to Carlsen. Carlsen came back in that match. What's going to happen, though, in their classical encounter in round three of the Sinquefield Cup? Before we discuss our game of the day, let's talk about the other ones. Firouzja took down Aronian in an absolutely wild game, while So was able to beat Caruana in a much more drawn-out, grindy game. Dominguez against Nepo. Dominguez had one big opportunity in this game, but was unable to find it and allowed Nepo to escape with a draw, while lastly, Mamedyarov and MVL drew, with the game never really veering from equality. Carlsen opens with d4. Niemann responds with an Imzo Indian. Carlsen picks a bit of a rare move here, g3, but you understand, it's a normal developing kind of move. Bishop g2, d5. Now Niemann gives up the bishop pair and grabs this pawn. He's not going to stay up a pawn forever, but at least he's up a pawn for a couple moves. c5 comes to open up the center. Carlsen takes back with the queen. You're losing some time by taking back with the queen, but the point is that the queen will be able to recapture this pawn on c4 to establish material equality. Here's an important move from Niemann. He plays e5, opening up the path for this bishop to develop. Otherwise, black would have had some serious problems getting that bishop into the game. White plays bishop g5, creating a pin here, which Niemann tries to resolve with h6. Carlsen's next move is actually a bit of an inaccuracy because of what happens in the game. He plays the move rook f to d1, and what would you do here? If you just move your queen here, this is exactly what Carlsen's hoping for. Queen c7 would not be good because now when white takes here, they've ruined your structure. They'll play a move like knight h4, and with the queens on the board, black's king is going to be in big danger of falling into an attack. Bishop e4 is coming, knight f5 is coming. Black's king is not feeling good. If queen e7, then Carlsen has gained a tempo because he's forced your queen to move twice. Now the knight comes to d2. The bishop is well placed on the long diagonal. The knight is going to recentralize, and Carlsen would have chances for a slight advantage. Instead of that, though, Niemann actually had this position in his prep, and he actually checked it the morning of this game. So that was an incredible job by him for him to predict the opening of this game, and he knew the move here is bishop e6 because these endgames are going to be favorable for black. So we're going to see a mass amount of trades. And finally, we reach this position. Both sides have a very shattered pawn structure. Black's king side is not looking good, while white's queen side is not in good shape either. But the reason that black has an advantage here is just that black's pieces are, for the time being, a bit more accurate. Black is going to be able to activate their pieces more quickly. Immediately, there's already a threat on the e2 pawn, which Carlsen decided to defend with king f1, though there was an option to sacrifice it with knight d2, and giving up this pawn in order to bring the knight into the game, attacking f6, so defends. Now knight d6, and this also would have been an option for white. You give up the pawn, but you do have chances. You have a lot of pressure on the b7 pawn with your knight, bishop, and rook that can all coordinate there. And you also have ideas of moves like f4 to try to break up black's structure on the king side. However, you can understand that Carlsen was hesitant to give up this pawn, and instead uses his king to defend it, and then brings his king to the center, which also makes a lot of sense because we need our king in the center in the endgame. Knight a5 is played. The knight is doing a good job. It's defending this pawn in case the bishop ever attacks it, but the knight can also look to move forward potentially later on. And after rook d1, here's the next question. Should you trade rooks? In a position like this, if you're playing for a win, if you want to keep your advantage, you should not trade rooks, because after the rooks are traded in the simplified endgame, there really aren't going to be nearly as many winning chances for black. But keeping the rooks on the board increases your ability to pressure your opponent's position and helps you maintain winning chances. Carlsen finally plays this knight d2 move we were talking about earlier. Now bishop e6 comes, and the pawn is under attack. After the pawn pushes up to c4, Carlsen decides to just pitch the pawn. He just decides he doesn't want it anymore. He's going to give it up in order to finally activate his pieces. His rook comes in. Now the bishop comes in. But okay, Niemann has managed to get up a full pawn. And after rook a8 attacking there, the rook comes back. Niemann decides, okay, time to start pushing forward. He goes for some kingside advances. Carlsen tries to break up Niemann's position on the king side with this move g4. If you get rid of this pawn, then the e4 pawn is likely to fall. But after rook c5, kicking out the bishop, and then knight c4, attacking the a3 pawn, white could go a4, which is what was played in the game. Now, the computer, especially the supercomputer that was analyzing this, gave white good drawing chances after bishop takes c4 and going into this rook endgame. But this actually sparked a bit of a funny exchange in the Niemann interview after the game. Basically, he did not believe for a second that this position had any amount of drawing chances for white, and you can understand why. With the rook so active, and especially with these two outside pawns, these are going to be incredibly strong in this sort of endgame. And if you could win this a3 pawn, these two pawns are just going to run up the board. And that explains why Carlsen, too, thought the move was a4. He goes back knight d6. This knight is actually anchoring black's entire position together, defending 4 of black's pawns. Now rook e7 comes. Niemann grabs another pawn. Now he's up 2 pawns. Rook d7, though, comes to attack the knight. And what would you do here? Knight c4 is certainly a reasonable move. This would also have been possible, but I really like the move Niemann picked. He played e3. The point is that you cannot take this knight, because now rook c1 check, and after rook d1, there are 2 ways to win the game. You could take here and win white's rook, or you could take the rook first, and then after taking here, there is no way to stop the promotion. So Carlsen is forced to take this pawn. Now this structure has been damaged, but Niemann is only up 1 pawn once again, but now the knight comes into e4. White's king is feeling a bit unsafe with the potential of rook c1 coming and this king kind of being trapped, so the king runs over. Now Niemann activates his rook on the 7th rank, so both sides are really showcasing the principle of how you need to activate your rook on the 7th rank. Now Carlsen grabs this pawn here, Niemann grabs a pawn there as well, gives a few checks just to repeat, and then finally goes king f6 to get out of that line of discoveries. Bishop comes back to d5, rook d2 sets up a pin, rook f7 check, king comes to g6. This is probably Carlsen's last chance to stay in the game. If he plays rook e7, he retains some drawing chances in this rook endgame. It certainly would not be an easy draw, and Niemann would have still had good chances to win the game, but especially if Carlsen finds the idea where however you defend this pawn, you could play h5 or you could just play king g5. White can play this move h3, trying to break up the structure, and after it takes, now the king comes to h2, winning the pawn back. And again, black would have some chances to win this game, but definitely better than what happened in the actual game. After rook d7, Niemann plays the move knight to g5, allowing a little tactic by Carlsen. It looks like he just blundered because he picked up the rook, but actually Niemann wins it right back with knight f3 check and taking the rook. In this type of endgame, with a minor piece endgame, a lot of times just being up 1 pawn is enough to secure the win, and that is the case here. Although Niemann does need to find one more accurate move, can you find the move that's going to allow him to convert this game? Niemann plays king e5, and the point is that you're dominating the bishop. You're stopping the bishop from going to any square that it wants to that would have pressured your pawns, and now white's pieces are going to remain passive. He tries to bring up the king for a second, knight f1 check though, and you could take this pawn, but black's going to take this pawn, then the knight's going to come back around and try and pick up this one. So instead, Carlsen tries to keep the king closer to the pawns. And then e4, and now Niemann just decides to grab that pawn. Carlsen is able to bring his bishop to a bit of a more active square, and he does start to pick up some pawns, but Niemann's knight is just in time to win Carlsen's pawn there over before it starts pushing. Finally, at this point, after the pawns are running up the board and king comes back to e5, Carlsen is going to be forced to move away this bishop, which will allow black's knight to come back into the game from the edge of the board. And with 2 completely extra pawns on the other side of the board, this is going to be totally winning for Niemann, which prompted Carlsen to resign. This was a huge game for so many reasons. Hans Niemann takes down the world champion with the black pieces. In doing so, he breaks an unbeaten streak of over 50 games in classical chess that Carlsen had. Moreover, with this game, Niemann crosses 2,700 in the live ratings. Checking in with our standings, the lowest seed in the tournament, Hans Niemann, currently sits atop the leaderboard with 2.5 points out of 3. Wesley So in clear second place with 2 points. And then we have a whole bunch of people, Nepo, Carlsen, Firouzja, MVL, and Dominguez, all with 1.5. Finally, at the bottom of the standings are Aronian, Mamedyarov, and Caruana with 1 point each.